Is God good?
I think he'd have to exist first.
If he is, why is there suffering and evil?
Well, apologists believe that there's suffering and evil because blaming it on human beings exercising free will somehow gets God off the hook.
Let's assume for the moment that God is all-powerful. This means that God can do anything that is logically possible. So he can create galaxies, and subatomic particles, and rainforests, and you. But God cannot do what is logically impossible.
Whenever you point out some problem with the idea of omnipotence, the standard apologist's response is to say, well, when we say that God is all-powerful, we don't literally mean he can do anything. Being all-powerful only really means being able to do things that are, not inconvenient to the rest of our theology. Like if you ask them if God is able to sin, they'll say, well, no, God can't sin because he's inherently good. So it would be logically impossible for him to sin, but somehow that doesn't count against his omnipotence. Suppose there were a being that had all the same powers that God has, plus the ability to do evil. That being would be more powerful than God. And if it's conceivable for a being to be more powerful than God, then what fucking sense does it make to say that God is all-powerful?
He cannot make a square circle, or a one-ended stick.
Or make something appear out of nothing. Oh wait.
So can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. So what if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing.
Freedom has a lot of value, but it doesn't have absolute value. Alvin Plantinga believes that a world in which people are free to choose between good and evil would be better than a world in which everybody is inherently good and incorruptible. But I don't see how that's the case. A world in which everybody only ever wanted to do good and weren't even tempted to do evil would be a much better world than one with free will, if you ask me.
But if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God. Because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people. The first humans endowed with the awesome power of free choice abused their freedom.
If God gave people the ability to choose between good and evil, then God took a risk. He knew that evil would be a likely consequence, and like everybody who knowingly takes a risk, he is responsible for that consequence. Since he could have prevented evil by creating human beings who only ever wanted to do good, the responsibility for the existence of evil ultimately rests on God's shoulders. Yes, it would be logically impossible for him to create free people who were forced to obey, but there's nothing logically forcing him to create free people to begin with.
The tragic consequences of their bad choice and our bad choices ripple across the world. God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but humans are responsible for their acts of freedom.
But if God could have prevented free actions by preventing free will in the first place, then I don't see why he's not ultimately responsible for both. Which makes me wonder if it would be bad for God to step in and prevent somebody from doing something evil. Wouldn't it also be bad for people to do the same thing? If God doesn't think it's proper to step in and prevent somebody from doing something evil, is it really appropriate that we be throwing violent people in jail? If God doesn't prevent people from committing evil acts, then who are we to step in and stop them? Aren't we robbing people of their God-given free will by trying to force them to obey the rules of morality? If God doesn't think it's proper to force them to obey, why should we be forcing them to obey?
But let's remember, we don't suffer alone. God will put an end to suffering and evil.
What's taking him so long? Is there an evil quota that we have to fill first?
And God became a man to suffer with us.
The way that Ray Comfort puts it is that Jesus paid the fine that we owe God. But Jesus is God, so really he paid the fine that we owed him to himself. If only it worked that way in real life. If only I could tell a judge that instead of me paying a fine that I owe to the government should just pay that fine to itself. That would be the biblical approach. Makes perfect sense, right? Is that how things would work under a Christian theocracy?